Hi, Stephen.
Hello.
Hi. Well, you were born in '67, so you were 18 in 1985.
Yes.
I read there were four albums that inspired you for this album.
Oh well, many albums,
okay,
but there's only four in the press release.
Yeah,
If you'd listed them all, it would have been a
okay.
long press release. Yeah.
So is it true what's stated in the press release? Pete, Gabriel, Kate Bush, Talk and Tears for Fears album.
Certainly for. I mean, when I was growing up, there was a tradition of what I call a very progressive or very sophisticated pop record. And what I mean by that, when I use the word pop, some people have a very sort of negative reaction to the word pop these days. For me, pop is the Beatles is pop. That's the quintessential pop group. And so for me, pop is a very broad thing. So when I say pop, I mean, it can be anything from, the Beatles to ABBA and everything in between. And for me, the 80s is particularly special because of this era when it was apparently possible to make records which were simultaneously very accessible, catchy melodies, catchy choruses, but at the same time, if you wanted to engage with them at a deeper level, you had great lyrics, great musicianship, great production, great arrangements, great ideas. And those four records are good examples of those kind of records. So, to a lesser or greater degree, they had a direct influence. But I think what's more important is I see them as representative of this time when people were really striving to make very intelligent, very smart pop music. And it seems to me that is not something we have a lot of in the 21st century.
You said, well, those four albums, but there were many more, but let's focus on those four albums. There are three from '85.
Okay.
Pete, the Soul album, The Hounds of Love, and The Color of Spring.
Okay.
Color of Spring. So that's why I wanted to see.
Okay, I hadn't realised that the three of them were from '85.
So I was thinking you were 18 years old, and
yes.
what sort of state were you in music-wise? Did you make music yourself? Did you listen to a lot of music? What?
I certainly was beginning to make music. I'd been making music on and off since I was like 11 or 12 years old. But I think I was beginning to take it seriously as a potential, career path. So it was very inspiring to me to hear that, because I'd grown up in a house where, my father was listening to very serious conceptual rock albums like Tubular Bells and Dark Side of the Moon. And my mother, on the other hand, was listening to the great pop music of the 70s like ABBA and Carpenters and the Bee Gees and all this stuff. So I grew up hearing both of these things and not really having any idea that there was even any difference. To me it was just great music. It's only when you become a teenager that you become aware of these kind of musical snobberies and musical borders that people, tend to put around things. And I still to this day find it very difficult to think in terms of music like that, in borders and like you're allowed to like this but you're not allowed to like this. You can like this but that means you can't like this. I never understood that. So to me, these records we're talking about were the perfect kind of synthesis of the pop sensibility that I liked and I enjoyed, and the more kind of conceptual rock music, the more sophisticated intellectual rock music that I'd also enjoyed. So these records were almost like perfectly situated between the two things. So to me, it was very exciting, and it was a kind of signpost of what was possible.
I was thinking, well, what were you doing when you were 18 and listening to this album? Can you still recall hearing, let's say, the Pete Gabriel album for the first time, or maybe the Kate Bush or the Talk? Is it something that I can? In the case of Talk and Kate Bush, I can remember being in the record store on the day those albums were released, buying them and taking them back with that sense of anticipation and excitement that you used to get when you bought an album on release day. It doesn't happen anymore because these days the idea of going to the record store on a day of release it doesn't have the same magic that it did then, because usually by the time the album's released everyone's heard it anyway. And in those days it was still a very exciting thing, and I think probably those would have been some of the first albums I would have bought on CD as opposed to vinyl, because I remember my father worked for Philips, and Philips were one of the first companies to make CD players. So I was one of the guys
I was one of the first guys in school, probably the first guy in school to have a compact disc player, which was like, wow, you know.
Yeah.
And so probably the Talk Talk album and the Kate Bush album would have been amongst the first things I would have experienced for the first time, certainly in terms of new albums, to hear them the first time in this pristine compact disc digital quality.
Yeah. Was it a good time for music?
I think the 80s was a fantastic time for music. You know, the 80s sometimes gets a kind of bad rap because there was a lot of not so great stuff, and it was a very, you know, it was the era of Margaret Thatcher, it was the era of, you know, bad clothes and silly hair, and there's a lot of artifice in pop.
The Stock Aitken and Waterman.
Yeah, but you know, even that somehow now in retrospect seems kind of, you know, compared to modern pop, Stock Aitken and Waterman seems full of character and full of invention. You know, modern pop is so, to me anyway, and I'm old admittedly, but to me modern pop seems so banal and so anodyne and so bland. Even Stock Aitken and Waterman seems like it's full of joy and character compared to that stuff. But anyway, at the time, of course, I would have dismissed all that as being candy floss pop, you know. But the 80s was definitely, in some ways, a continuation of the 70s, in that there was a lot of musicians that were using the possibilities of the new technology, and particularly the Kate Bush album and the Peter Gabriel album were embracing the possibilities of sampling, which was a relatively new technological innovation, certainly in terms of being in the music industry. I think it'd been in the movie industry for a while, but in the music industry, sampling was a big, you know, new thing, and there were a lot of musicians very excited about the possibilities of it. And so it was very exciting. Technology was still, you know, there was a lot of new technology, new synthesizers, sampling, digital recording, all of these things were kind of inspiring to musicians. And there was still, I think, there was still a feeling that you could be innovative, you could push the boundaries, you could still create things that people had never heard before, which you can't do now. You simply, there's no way you can create music that people will have that kind of response to. But I was still hearing stuff in the 80s that was like, to me, was expanding my idea about what music could be.
And then 4 years later, we had the Tears for Fears album.
Yeah.
What did strike that about that album? What did you like about it?
It's just genius. It's interesting because that album came right at the very end of the 80s.
Yeah.
And in many respects, it was the last great 80s, you know, folly.
Yeah.
It was an album that took 3 years to make. There's only 8 songs on it. It took 3 years to make. It's the sort of album that when you listen to it, you can see or you can hear the amount of attention and care that has been put into every last decision. You know, every sound, every lyric, every moment, every beat, every melody has been pored over and refined to the point that it really feels like a masterpiece, a work of art. Great songs, great production, great arrangements, great playing. One of the best sounding records I've ever heard. Just sonically, I mean, the word cinematic is the word that springs to mind. Widescreen, epic, shamelessly pretentious.
Is there one song that you like? Well,
oh, I like all of them. I mean, the two big singles, "Woman in Chains" and "Sowing the Seeds of Love," classic pop singles, you know.
How did those albums, or maybe this period of music, how did it influence this album?
Really, in the sense that it's possible to make an album that is immediate, accessible, catchy, but without sacrificing any of the ambition and what's special about me as a musician, I hope. So the Peter Gabriel album is a great example. Here's a guy that came from a more experimental, more underground background, who arrived at this point where he was able to make an album which had fabulous, catchy pop music on it, but at the same time, he didn't sacrifice anything that was special about him. Everything there that you associate with his unique musical voice, his unique musical vocabulary, and his style and his character is still in that record. So, because I say that because a lot of the time when people make a more, shall we say, mainstream sounding record, there's always the accusation that they've lost a lot of what's special about them. They've sacrificed something. And I think those albums prove that's not the case.
Was it for you, did you actually set out to make a more accessible, more pop album? Was it something that you really wanted to do?
Yeah, I wanted to make a record. Okay, firstly, I think every time I approach a new record, I'm looking for something different. To me, there's no point in making the same record twice, and there's no point in repeating myself. So I'm always looking for something that will feel like a next step in evolution, even if that step is sideways rather than forwards, or everything doesn't have to be an innovation. Sometimes it can be just focusing on a different side of your musical personality. And I've always had that side of my musical personality. Whether people acknowledge it or not, there's always been in my music, there's always been a strong pop sensibility.
Your mom's side.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Totally. And I've always loved great pop, and I have written, even on these albums that are big conceptual, works, there's been moments, to my ears at least, there have been moments of pure pop, or at least melodic. And I think the decision I made this time was, okay, this time I want to focus on that side of my musical character. I want to focus on the song, the melody as paramount, and try and make a record that perhaps is a little bit easier for people who don't even know my music, a little bit a doorway that people can walk through that brings them into my world.
But did it change your way of working a lot?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
How?
Well, firstly, there's a lot more simplicity in terms of the performance side. So there's nothing on this album that I would call technical or muso. Not there's anything wrong with that, but I've had some very technical moments on my last record. I've had some players that can do extraordinary things. This time around, I actually ended up doing a lot more myself. So I played a lot of the guitar myself, the bass, the keyboards. And part of that because I wanted a more natural, less showy sort of side of things, because I can't play fast and I can't play clever stuff. But what I can do is I can play in the service of the song. So to me, when I play guitar, it feels like an extension of the vocals and the song. So it's definitely a different way of working this time for me.